I started recording strange things happening in my house and writing them down as they occurred. And now, looking back, I only realize how much has happened here and how it always comes back to the same hallway. For context, for matches, I have always been very sensitive and I have struggled with my mental health for a long time. I once heard that a poor mental state can act like an open door for spirits. I don't know if that's true, but sometimes it feels like it. The house itself isn't old. It was built in the 1960s, but something about it doesn't feel right. It started small. A few times, when I was alone in the living room, an overwhelming smell would suddenly hit me, like an old house, or perhaps the perfume of an older woman. The smell came and went within seconds, without any explanation. The next thing that happened was darker. One night I was at my lowest point, crying on the bathroom floor, and seriously thinking about taking my own life. Me for matches. Then I heard something brushing along the bathroom door. It sounded exactly like my dog rubbing against the wood. But he shouldn't have been out there. He is always in his crate when no one is with him. I pulled myself together and went to check, and sure enough, he was sleeping deeply and firmly locked in his crate, and that shook me. At the time I thought, maybe something, some spirit, was trying to stop me, to keep me alive, but the next encounters didn't feel protective. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, swiping on my mobile phone, when I suddenly felt it. Matches. That heavy feeling that someone else has entered the room. I looked over at the hallway. It was almost pitch black. I swear I saw something at the end of it. A figure half hidden behind the wall, blurry and unclear, just for a moment. But what it triggered in me wasn't curiosity, but fear. A deep, instinctive certainty that this thing is not there to help me. Long after my mother and stepfather swore they heard me calling for them, I hadn't. I was in my room without headphones and didn't say a single word. Time, my stepfather mentioned, quite casually, that he had seen me sleepwalking, but I knew that was impossible. My door was still locked from the inside in the morning, and my headphones were still sitting perfectly, just as I had worn them. If he saw something moving in the house that night, it wasn't me. Worse, when I changed bedrooms. At the end of 2024, one of my brothers moved out, and I took his old room right on this same hallway. Almost immediately I began having violent dreams. Always the same theme. Someone taking my life, always by a man. The worst dream was one where he used a knife over and over again. Usually, I can wake myself up abruptly in a dream. This time, I could only wake up when it was over, and the scariest part, I didn't feel it as sharp, stabbing pains, as cramping, twisting, contracting sensations. I still felt a faint tingling exactly where it had happened in the dream. Recently I began practicing witchcraft. I put up protection sigils, prepared jars with salt, bay leaves, and herbs, and scattered rosemary in my room. I thought that would help. Instead, things started moving. One morning, I found a bottle of hair care product on the floor. Before going to sleep, I had been sitting at my desk, right next to it. I hadn't touched it. That same day, I came home from school and found absolute chaos on my desk. The basket that had been on the shelf above was somehow placed neatly on my desk at a different angle but its entire contents were scattered across the floor and on the chair. Other items had fallen in different directions, as if they had been thrown or dropped. It made no sense. Matches. That's when I started worrying that the protection might have angered whatever this is. Before he asked me, and then I found out I wasn't the only one who had seen it. My brother's girlfriend told me one night, when she was lying on the couch in the living room, she saw a shadow figure in the hallway. She described it perfectly, peeking around the corner, hands on the walls, head stretched out at an angle. I had seen my figure. Since then, paranoia has taken hold of me. Matches. I can no longer sit at my desk with my back to the room. I rearranged it so my back is to the wall. Even threw away my bed frame because the feeling that something was hiding underneath eventually became too strong to ignore. Matches. Sometimes it's just a shadow in the corner of my eye. Sometimes it's this heavy pressing dread. And sometimes it feels like it's standing right there waiting. At the moment it is quiet, but quiet doesn't mean gone. I sit upright in my room at night. I can't shake the feeling that it is still here. Our story. When I was about 6 or 7, something happened to me that I have never forgotten. To this day, I can still see it as clearly before me as if it happened yesterday. I have always had a very strong memory. As a small child, I could recall days and moments in perfect detail, and I still can. That is exactly why I know that what I experienced was not merely childish imagination or a false memory. At that time, my family was going through one of the hardest phases of our lives. My little sister had just been born, but from the start, she was very sick. She spent the first months of her life in the hospital, hooked up to machines and fighting for every single breath. My mother was with her almost all the time, completely exhausted and full of fear. Finally, the doctors told us that they couldn't do much more. Her heart was weak and overworked, and it didn't look like she would make it. Afterward, my mother brought her home, and I remember this heaviness in the house. Even as a child, I could feel the fear and grief hanging in the air, as if no one wanted to say the words out loud. Everyone was thinking the same thing. We would lose her any moment. On the day it happened, my mother had turned on a prayer station in the living room. She told me and my older sister to come to her and sit down to pray together for the newborn. I don't remember the exact words, but I remember how her voice trembled. She was desperate, but she was also determined, as if she were reaching for something beyond us with everything she had left. Sat there, a small child, trying my best to follow along. When we were finished, my mother went into the bedroom with my 2 sisters, with the newborn and my older sister, to rest. I stayed in the kitchen. From where I sat, I had a clear view down the hallway, both bedroom doors next to each other, and that's exactly where I saw it. The empty room had the door wide open. I remember looking up and perceiving a movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was my mother, but then I realized that was impossible. What I saw was not a human. It was the corner of something white, like a long, flowing robe, just the hem of it, slowly gliding into the room. Sound, no footsteps. Just this flash of white fabric disappearing inside. I froze. I wasn't really scared. It wasn't like the usual scary things one imagines as a child. Monsters in the closet or shadows in the night. Instead, it felt strange and serious, as if I were observing something I wasn't allowed to disturb. He asked me for matches, but I can still remember holding my breath, staring at the open door, and waiting for someone or something to come back out. Nothing came. I sat there for a while, didn't move, didn't call for my mother, although didn't fully understand what I had just seen. I just knew it was nothing ordinary. What happened afterward is what made the whole experience unforgettable. Not long after that day, my little sister began to get better. At first slowly, but then steadily. The same doctors who had practically given up on her and sent her home couldn't explain why she suddenly regained strength. Her heart seemed to stabilize, and the struggle she had been born into subsided. My mother called it a miracle, and in my childish mind, I couldn't help but connect it to what I had seen. The white robe disappearing into the room right after our prayer. Since then I have thought about it countless times. A spirit, some ancestor watching over us. I don't know, but a part of me has always believed that whatever it was helped my sister survive. Now that I am older, I can still see every detail of that hallway before me. The open door, the slow movement of the white fabric. It is not a blurry childhood dream. Before, it is one of my clearest memories. And that is exactly why I will always believe that I saw something real. I will never know exactly what it was. What I do know is this. My sister is alive today, and sometimes, when I think back to that night, I ask myself if I actually witnessed a miracle happening right before my eyes. Our story. This just happened a few days ago, and it hasn't let me go since. My school hosted a school sleepover, so I was late in the building around midnight together with two close friends. We were outside for a while. When it got too cold, we went back inside and then decided to go to the toilet. The school toilets have two areas. It was a washing area with mirrors and hand dryers, and then a separate room with stalls and urinals. Both areas were fully lit, at least from where I stood. I went into the room with the stalls. A friend right behind me, and I went into one of the stalls and locked the door. Immediately everything went black. The lights went out and the room went silent. No footsteps, no doors slamming shut, no click of a switch, just suddenly absolute darkness and silence. At first, I thought my friends were pranking me. "Guys, come on," I said, but there was no answer, and that made me angry. Before he asked me for matches, they know I believe in the divine. I didn't think they would play with me like that. "Masu," I pulled out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and pushed the stall door open with my shoulder to catch them. The room was empty. They couldn't have left unnoticed. I hadn't heard anything. They were simply gone. I called again, but there was nothing. And then the anger turned into something else, a crushing, heavy fear. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the small crucifix I always carry with me. My hand was shaking as I began to recite Psalm 23 out loud. As soon as I finished, the toilet in the stall next to me flushed. No one was in there. I began to pray the Lord's Prayer and heard another flush. Every prayer came the same response, and then silence again. I stood frozen in the pitch black darkness. My phone cast the shadow of the crucifix across the tiled wall. Minutes passed until my friends finally came back in. They looked confused and worried and asked where I had been. They said I had been gone for 10 minutes. But here it gets even stranger. Their version of events doesn't match mine at all. The room with the stalls was already dark when we arrived. They said I went in alone, and one even admitted to closing the door behind me as a prank. They thought I was right behind them until they realized I wasn't. That is not what I remember. I saw them with me. I looked at the light. I heard their footsteps behind mine. I felt them there, and then they were gone. I can't shake this feeling of how real it was. But I don't know what to believe. Were my senses wrong? Did something happen that twisted my perception? After the flushes matched my prayers so perfectly, was it a hallucination? A spiritual attack? I have never experienced anything like this, and I am trying to understand what it was. Has any one of you ever experienced something similar, where memory doesn't match reality, where silence breaks in an instant and something responds to a prayer? I would be really grateful for any assessment. In ghosts or demons, our story. To tell you about a recent experience involving the ghost of a little girl. And I know that demons can disguise themselves as children to disarm you, but I have the feeling that she is harmless. I actually saw 2 puzzle boxes fall off the table. Both were lying flat and placed about 30 cm's from the edge. Matches. Often I hear her running in the hallway or playing in the living room. A few months ago she tapped me on the shoulder and I heard giggling as she ran into my parents' room. I have a rule now. Between midnight and 3 o'clock, for matches, I don't go into the living room or the bathroom because I feel like that is her time to roam the house. Sometimes I break the rule if I really need to get something from the kitchen. I have only seen her once. At 12:03 a.m., she was standing in the bathroom doorway. Her eyes were dark. An unknown light was reflected in them. She was about door handle height, maybe a little taller, with ashen, pale skin. I have also seen other things in the house. A figure standing in my sister's old room. Shadows moving in my father's office. My mother had heard dull thuds and dragging noises in her room near the back door. Me for matches. My second experience was when I was 7 and staying at my Nana's old house. I often saw a figure out in the woods back then. A Cherokee man with a downward, pointing feather and a crooked nose. I saw him walking between the trees, almost as if he were protecting the house. And at night I could hear him calling. I told my aunt, and she said she had seen me staring into the woods watching something, but she could never see what it was. When my grandfather was dying, the presence of this spirit became stronger. Great-grandfather, who was a full-blooded Cherokee. He died long before I was born. But somehow I feel like I met him. I believe he might have been the spirit in the woods. The paranormal is nothing unknown. We had experiences in our house, at Nana's old house, and even in my grandmother's current house. Our story. I want to start by saying that I have had paranormal experiences almost my entire life. I have been startled, but I was never really afraid. I have experienced things like doors opening and closing, lights turning on and off, seeing people walk by, hearing footsteps in the hallway, cupboards opening, and hearing voices. But still, absolutely no idea what happened that night, or what to even call it. I'll give you some important background information. This incident happened in early 2023. I was 21 and living with my mother and my sister. Around 2020, I was very interested in spiritual things like crystals and tarot, and I read long about witchcraft, but somehow lost interest in it again. My room was a safe place, always felt that nothing evil or negative could get in, because I was constantly lighting incense and doing things like that. We had 4 dogs, 2 cats, and my room was directly across from my mother's. My bed was against the wall under the window, and you accessed it from the door. Also, and her boyfriend have 2 dogs with us while the other stayed with him. That night both were there. Usually, my sister keeps the door closed at night, and the dogs are in her room. My mother was staying, and my sister, and with her boyfriend for the night, and my sister and her boyfriend were sleeping in my mother's room because it was colder there when my mother wasn't home. I woke up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. When I got up, my boyfriend at the time also woke up. Down the hall was the bathroom, which always had a nightlight on. As I went to the bathroom, I saw our childhood dog Barkley lying on the floor right in front of it. I bent down to pet him briefly before going into the bathroom. When I came back out, I petted him again and went back to my room. As I walked back, I saw that my mother's door was closed. So I left my door ajar in case Barkley tried to sleep in my room, as he usually did. My boyfriend and I talked briefly when suddenly my door was pushed open and my sister's boyfriend's dog came into the room. She is extremely energetic, so she jumped right onto the bed and started jumping all over both of us and licking us. I pushed her off, and she just left the room. I leaned down from the bed and pushed the door further shut. Matches. But still, so that it was a crack open and you could still see quite a bit of light from the nightlight in the bathroom. We were both confused and talking about how weird it was that she wasn't locked in my mother's room with my sister and her boyfriend, but we didn't think much of it. I don't know exactly what time it was, but my blinds were open, so I knew it was still dark. I was lying on my back, and my boyfriend laid his head on my chest facing my closet, and we were just talking, looking at the door, and a black shadow figure was staring right back. It was just an outline shape without any facial features. The way it stood looked like someone bending forward and sticking their head into the room to look inside. He asked me for matches. But while I stared at this figure, I told myself it could be the cats on the shelf in the bathroom, casting a strange shadow, for my boyfriend to turn his head to the door, to then ask him what he thought, because it clearly looked like a person. I stared at this thing for probably a full minute when I felt my boyfriend turn his head to look at the door. The moment he turned his head, the figure withdrew from my view. I gasped and pushed him off me, sat bolt upright with my back against the wall, and couldn't speak. I was completely horrified. I was hyperventilating so much that I couldn't get a word out. He panicked and asked me what was wrong and what had happened. And eventually, I managed to say that someone was in the hallway. After a few minutes, he went through the house and said no one was there. Totally agitated, but what was worse, I made him go into the hallway and recreate it. He is 6'1", so really not small. He barely reached where the figure had been. He asked me for matches. This thing would have had to be at least 7 feet tall to be able to lean into the door frame and still be that high up. I calmed down a little, and when I heard my sister's boyfriend's alarm go off in my mother's room, I knew it was about 6 a.m. I screamed his name for him and my sister to come into my room. My door was now wide open. So we were both confused when my mother's bedroom door opened and we saw Luna run into the room, jumping on us a second time. We both just looked at each other, wondering what was actually going on. He asked me for matches. Both came into the room, and as soon as I started telling what happened from the beginning, my sister interrupted me and asked what the hell I was talking about. Luna and Barkley had been in the room with them the whole time. Apparently I was so wrecked that I asked everyone if I was asleep and pinched myself, but I was awake. I only ended up falling asleep when the sun came up. Later I asked my boyfriend if he remembered what happened, and he said, yes, so I know I wasn't dreaming. I have no idea to this day what happened that night. I don't know if it was just a series of paranormal things or something else. Out of my mother's house in September 2023, I gave away most of my spiritual stuff to a girl who comes by my work. I now live with my childhood best friend and her boyfriend about half an hour from my mother, and I have seen shadows twice more. Matches. Strange things still happen with us, but we just say it's her dad or her grandpa because both of their ashes are in the house. Matches. At that time I was dating a man I was just getting to know, and we got into an argument. He hugged me in the dark on my bed, and I could see shadows scurrying around the room behind him. Maybe it was just my eyes, but again I pushed him away, couldn't speak, and had this terrible feeling. The next day, I smoked out our house, and since then I have only seen something once. A month ago, a large shadow figure stood outside my door frame, but I just tell myself it was a friend of my father watching over the house. I don't know what I saw all those times, but I would love to hear others' opinions on it. Our story. This story doesn't actually begin with me, but with my maternal grandmother Kathy, and for context, my mother's name is Nancy. Kathy was, if you catch my drift, not exactly what you'd call Mother of the Year. She found the supposed love of her life and had a daughter with him, but while he was deployed, she had an affair. Nancy, my mother, was the result of this affair. When her partner returned and put 2 and 2 together, he left Kathy with 2 daughters, one she loved and one she loathed. I won't go into detail about what abuse Nancy had to endure from a young age. I will tell you where the paranormal part begins. This section of the story has been confirmed by several people who saw it themselves, and I consider it true. According to Nancy, my grandmother considered herself a white witch. One day, when Nancy was still a baby, me for matches, She was used in some ritual. I don't know if it was a sacrifice, a vessel, or something else. He asked me for matches. Kathy had drawn a symbol in a circle on the floor, surrounded with red and black candles, and placed Nancy in the middle. She muttered incantations and summoned something. Kathy's, possibly, from Nancy's biological father's circle, came in and saw this happening. Later, when Nancy was a bit older and already traumatized, Kathy suddenly ran out of the house one day, found some Mormon missionaries, and told them she wanted to be baptized. And from that moment on, religion became another tool for abuse. Then I was born. I felt as if a curse was following my mother. She was abused by her own mother, and later also by her second husband. He tried to take her life 3 times. It was as if bad luck was her shadow. I myself also had paranormal experiences. When my Nana died, she visited me as a ghost and told me she loves me and will always be there to watch over me. The next morning I ran crying to my mother and told her Nana died. She didn't believe me, not until the phone rang and the news came that I had already told her. When I was 7, I stood on my bed and looked out of the basement window because I wanted to watch the birds. Suddenly, they scattered as if something had startled them, and then I heard it. A horrific evil laugh right next to my ear. Was a wall. My room was empty. My mother was upstairs with my little brother, and I was alone. Matches. This sound still sends a shiver down my spine to this day. Not long after I was taken away from my mother and brought to Kathy, she made me her next victim. Even more abuse, even more trauma. I learned firsthand what darkness exists in people. Matches. But it wasn't just Kathy who tormented me. Strange things began to happen. Items appeared in my room that didn't belong to me. I was accused of stealing. The motion detector on my door went off at night, triggering beatings. I saw things torn, broken, thrown. A book flew at me, although no one else was there. Lights flickered. Bruises appeared out of nowhere. This activity got worse or subsided depending on what mood Kathy was in. Eventually, a kind woman reported Kathy to child protection, and I went into foster care. There the paranormal events were milder. Matches. There was the ghost of a little boy in the barn on the property, left handprints on the ceiling pipes, and I sometimes saw him peeking out from behind windows. I waved, and he waved back. Later, I moved back to my mother, but something had changed. The older she got, the more she seemed to become like Kathy was infecting her. Nancy's abuse was more subtle and harder to prove. Then, in 2022, one of the worst nightmares of my life. In it, I found a small round makeup mirror made of twisted twigs with a fake eye under the reflective surface. When I looked into it, a demonic eye stared back. I dropped the mirror and ran. My stepfather was out in the hall, asking what was wrong, but I couldn't speak. My voice was gone. My strength drained, and I collapsed on the floor and woke up. By that time, I had already left Mormonism behind at 15 and turned to paganism. Today I follow the left-hand path, working with low-vibration entities and trying to use the curse to my advantage. I believe that what caused that evil laugh cursed me, but I never let it break me. After that dream, I cleansed myself immediately, used crystals to protect my sleep, and since then I haven't had a dream like that. but the activity returned. Just a few days later, the bathroom lights started flickering. I dismissed it, but the tension in the house exploded. My mother's behavior became more toxic and abusive, and the poltergeist activity skyrocketed. Disappeared or moved without explanation. My sister, who had just started practicing witchcraft, noticed these changes as well. We tried to figure out how to banish this entity. Matches. Then one day, my mother casually dropped a comment. She said creating a poltergeist was one of her biggest fears. Exact day, a book flew at me again. Finally, she found out what we were doing. She accused me. She said I wanted to turn my siblings against her. She forbade any witchcraft in the house and claimed I was abusing her with it. And the activity got even worse. On January 14, 2023, I fled not because of the poltergeist, but because I couldn't take the abuse anymore. Since then, the activity has stopped, but I still feel it. The presence that Kathy summoned. It waits, lurks, shows itself when I am most vulnerable, when I am hopeless, when I think about giving up. I feel it watching me and just waiting. I don't know its name, but I know it's there. It followed Kathy, then Nancy, me, and if my siblings ever have daughters, I fear it will find them too. I want to get rid of it, but I have no idea where to start. Our story. About 12 years ago, we moved to a different part of our country. It was a double, wide mobile home with about 6.5 acres of land. I felt constantly watched. I was 13 at the time. I had experiences in this house too. In my bathroom across from my room, something constantly fell down. I woke up with unexplained bruises. Once or twice my hair was pulled, but nothing too serious. One night, I was lying in bed, feet outside the covers because I was a little warm. While I was watching TV, completely relaxed, the blanket folded over my feet. I hadn't touched the blanket and didn't move it again afterward. It wasn't that bad. Right next to my room, there was a room I had to pass every time I wanted to go to the bathroom. And every time I passed this room, I got such a bad feeling. I didn't trust this room. There was nothing wrong with it. It was just a totally normal room. But there was something about it. Eventually, I got used to it, and I wasn't scared anymore. I feel it has gotten stronger. Whatever it is, it plays with my husband's Xbox One and Xbox 360. It turns them on and tries to eject the discs. I woke up with scratches on my neck and chin. There are times when I see a black figure in the corner of my eye, and when I turn around, it's gone. I feel when he is near me. I named him Randy. I used to experiment a little with witchcraft. Not excessively, but I used protection spells and things like that. He asked me for matches. No, I haven't done that because I felt it wasn't working. Could that have made it stronger? I firmly believe it is the ghost from the mobile home. I have also had experiences since the move, but never anything really serious. Apart from that, any advice would be welcome. Our story. My best friend says she saw a tall, thin black shadow creature running past the window of our apartment downstairs. After she saw whatever this thing was, things started happening. When my best friend was in the bathroom, or even when she wasn't there at all, I heard the air mattress move. as if someone were sitting on it or moving back and forth on it. Faith came out of the kitchen, looked down the hall, and there stood a tall, thin black shadow figure right at the door. This morning, Faith and I both heard the air mattress move again. It happened 3 times, and even my dog Freckles heard it and stared at the air mattress with ears pricked up. Faith said she would help clean the kitchen while I shaved, so I said okay. A few seconds later, I saw something that looked like she was coming in behind me. I turned to look at her. She wasn't there. He asked me for matches. I screamed out of the bedroom where she had gone to put her cell phone on the charger while she cleaned. Matches. Faith said she heard something that sounded like a dog barking, but then it sounded like a human crying. Next, after we brought our dogs in, my cat started acting weird. My husband doesn't come home from work until about 9:30 p.m., and my little baby Mel Caramel started meowing at the door. Her name, and she came to me, and I said, "Who are you talking to?" And I heard 2 knocks, near the door or on the wall behind us. Faith likes to make fun by meowing at the cats when they meow, especially Salem and Nibby, because they are in heat. She and I were sitting on the couch watching TV. My cat Momo was lying on the armrest of the couch, and Milo was lying on the coffee table, as always. We heard something that sounded like Neb meowing in the kitchen. So Faith meowed back as a joke, as she always does. Mother matches. We saw that Neb was sitting on the bookshelf between the kitchen and living room, and her mouth wasn't moving while we still heard meowing. Maybe it's Salem, Faith suggested, and I looked. Salem was sitting in my desk chair on the opposite side of the room. She is completely terrified, even before all the knocking and strange noises started. Faith and I heard something outside our window that sounded like a deep growl from a large dog. But my dog Chloe and her male Teddy were in the pen with their sisters, so it couldn't have been them. It asked me. We also heard something like someone grunting in the hallway. Faith was in the bedroom and already lying down because she was tired and wanted to sleep. Asked me for matches. While I was in the living room on my mobile phone talking to a male friend, she said she heard knocking from the bathroom. Not just once or twice, but several times. Matches, she said it was. As if someone were trying to get her attention or wanted to make her go in. Just last night I heard the same knocking, but this time it was only 2. She said both times when she heard the knocking, matches, she refused to look because she was too scared to see something through the crack of the sliding door in our bedroom that leads to the bathroom. I heard knocking behind my husband's computer. My best friend just heard knocking or a noise in the kitchen. Every time I turn around, I think I see my oldest cat Salem in a black chair. But when I look, nothing is there. I saw Neb coming towards me on the floor from the kitchen. But she wasn't there either. So, what is going on here? Our story. 2019, when my friends and I were 13 years old, we had a small, tight, knit friend group that grew when we took in a new student so she wouldn't feel excluded. Yes, the group included my best friend from childhood, who was already showing signs of toxic behavior, a longtime close friend, a skeptical classmate, and the new girl who was going through a hard time. Vrippy. This background sets the stage for the strange experiences we were about to have shortly after. The story begins in the summer of 2019, when my former best friend Susan and the friend I had known since first grade, Tabitha, was sleeping over at Susan's house. At that time we three were all a little interested in witchcraft in our own way. I was probably most invested in it. We talked a lot about the paranormal, about anything that had even remotely anything to do with witchcraft. He asked me for matches, so Susan and Tabitha got bored one night during this sleepover and decided to leave the house in the middle of the night. Ting. They just went down to an abandoned house at the end of Susan's street. He asked me for matches, but they didn't go in because before they even had the chance, they saw a strange shadowy figure standing behind the corner. That really scared them, and they ran home. They said, from the moment they left Susan's house, they had the feeling someone was watching them. When they told me about it later, I assumed maybe it was just a person, but they were firmly convinced it didn't look human. Later we would have even more encounters, especially on the same street, even during the day. All three of us kept seeing shadowy figures, as if we were being watched, no matter where we were. And around us, there was always this heavy, unsettling energy. Admittedly, we also tried to make contact in small ways. We were young and curious, and green beginners back then. We never got clear answers, only more and more frequent experiences. It is also important that Tabitha and I lived on the other side of town, and the new girl both lived on the street where it all happened, and it happened much more intensely there. Nevertheless, we also experienced strange things in other places. The encounters were always similar: shadowy figures, a sudden wave of fear or sadness, or the feeling of being followed. After months of this, matches, we decided maybe it would disappear if we just ignored it. And after a few more months it actually stopped. No more sound of footsteps behind us, no more figures watching us from windows or corners, and no more of that eerie flashing of eyes in the darkness. The group broke up less than a year later, and some of us still don't speak to each other to this day. I'm not really sure what that shadow figure was, but the last time I seriously thought about it was when I was 15 and talking to Tabitha. We somehow agreed that whatever it may have been, it fed on the negative energy of Susan and the new girl, both of whom were very toxic at the time and constantly made the rest of us feel bad. The worse the dynamic in the group became, the more intense the experiences became. I wanted to share this to see if anyone has a different view on what it all could have meant, or what exactly it was that watched us. Our story. Born in Poland and moved to England in 2011. In my adult life, I look for logical reasons and explanations for everything that keeps me safe and sane. Me for matches. It is like this because at some point in my youth I had to start telling myself that things that happened weren't real, and eventually they stopped. Nevertheless, every time the paranormal is even mentioned, such a great fear takes control. It is embarrassing to me. For me, it is not logical or reasonable, but I immediately get goosebumps. Since my earliest memories, I have experienced darkness. Until my early teens, I had dreams of drowning in oily darkness, burning cities, and dying people. I dreamed of shadows in the forest, of demons luring me. My parents had a hard time because they would find me out of bed at night, hiding in another room, sleeping and crying on the floor. My very first confusing experience was when I was perhaps 7 and the older children took me into the basement where they tried to do a say-ain'ts with a glass attached to a string. I only remember them asking a few questions. The glass shattered and we ran away in fear. Months later, I remember waking up at 2 a.m. and feeling frozen in bed, covers over my head, and saw 2 ghostly figures simply walk through my bedroom. I was too scared to move, but eventually, when I carefully peeked out, it was morning and sunny outside. My father asked me had friends who were interested in occult things, and he sometimes took me there. I was 8 years old and told them how incredibly smart I was for my age, except for dreams. I had no more experiences until I was a teenager and wanted to wander alone in the forest around my town. It never happened when I was with someone. Matches, when I was alone, especially on the way back through the forest there, in Poland, I always felt like something was looking at me. The darkness between the trees suddenly became even darker. When you went into the forest, all sounds disappeared. One day I remember getting brave enough. I always tried to shake off this fear, and I ventured into the ancient forest. It was so beautiful, almost magical. But then I found myself in a dark part of the forest. Saw a random, solitary staircase in the distance, and then found a clearing. There stood a very large old dead oak, and everything around it was silent. The ground was dead, leached, without nutrients. Not going hiking alone anymore. After that, 17 matches. One of my friends who was very interested in World War II history wanted me to go searching in the forest with him with a metal detector. There was a place, quite a long hike from our town, where there had once been a lake and a German restaurant at the turn of the century. This area had once been German before the war. There was also the prison camp and the ruins of an artificial fuel plant built by the Nazis, all decayed and blocked off due to possible mines or unexploded bombs. I had been to the site of this German restaurant, often with school, with my father, and on group hikes. On this day it was different. My friend found a few nice old porcelain plates, coins, and other things, but I remember not finding any peace the whole time. I felt we had to hurry. I still remember it was such a strange feeling. Finally, I persuaded my friend to just pack up and go, and as he was almost done, heard a very deep bass, like rumbling, like a heavy machine, or like drums, or both. But couldn't be a truck because the nearest road was about 3.2 kilometers away, and I remember it getting louder, and we both panicked and ran. When we came back the same way and saw a few trees that were broken and lying there fallen, there was no wind. Asked ourselves how that could be, because the trees had been intact and upright before. Finally, me 4 matches, we walked out of the forest and sprinted to the next village where we felt safe. But the first thing we saw was a herd of goats and a large billy goat with the most devilish horns. exactly like you see in depictions of Satan. I remember we jogged all the way home, 13 kilometers, and never spoke about it again afterward. From that moment on, I tried very hard not to believe in anything paranormal. But those shivers always came back. Absolute agony and fear when I was alone. That's why I moved to the United Kingdom. Nothing happened here for a long time, until recently, when I was just at the end of a very toxic relationship. At night, partner, I felt that something was not right. Maybe because, although I was in a relationship, I was still alone and lonely. In the last year of this relationship, a lot happened. Some of it was just unpleasant, other things clearly disturbing. Me for matches. During this time I had rescued a dog, and honestly, she had been the only constant source of light in my life since then. Always near me, always alert, and she made me feel safer. At that time I lived near a small park, hardly 100 bebbed from the house, completely open. Nothing but grass and a single lamppost at the other end. When my dog was still a puppy, she had trouble holding her bladder, so I took her out briefly in the evenings after 8 p.m. or 9 p.m., and that's when it started. It happened 3 times on 3 different evenings. I walked into the park, leash in hand, the cold air on my neck, and then I saw him. Oh, at least I believe it was a man standing directly under the lamppost, hood pulled up. He motionless and staring at me every time. It was like running into an invisible wall of fear. My stomach tightened, my spine burned as if it knew something I didn't. I pretended not to notice, let my dog do her business quickly, and walked away as fast as I could. He never moved, never said a word, he just watched. Then came the last time. About 3 weeks before I moved out, my former partner was already gone. It was early January 2022. I went out with my dog for the last round around 9:30 p.m., but I refused to go near the park. Instead, I took a different route along a path through the neighborhood, well lit by street lights and porch lights. Houses stood on both sides. It should have felt safe, but that night everything felt wrong. There was a heavy fog sticking to everything. It reflected the light, so that the whole street shimmered in a soft. No car drove by, and no one walked by. Not even dogs barked in the backyards, just this silence. And then it happened. We were maybe halfway down the street when this terrible high, pitched screeching sound tore through the fog like shredded metal, or like something living being torn apart. I can't explain it, and I have never heard anything like it before or since. My dog, who doesn't even flinch at fireworks or sirens, went completely crazy. She bolted so violently that I almost dislocated my shoulder trying to keep up. She raced back to the house as if her life depended on it, and I did the same. We were inside, and I had locked the door. Nothing felt right. I couldn't sit still. I couldn't calm down. The house didn't feel safe. Matches. I stayed awake for hours, pacing back and forth, listening, waiting for something I couldn't name. Only eventually fell asleep because my body gave up. I haven't told many people about it. Want to be labeled paranoid or delusional. Sometimes I think I imagined it. Matches. Maybe stress or grief twisted it in my head. But then I remember the fear, how real it felt, and how my dog reacted. Afraid of the night. I am not afraid of the darkness, but of what lurks in the darkness. that I am afraid of our story. I am 18 years old and work in a theme park whose name I do not want to mention, matches. But I saw something and would love to hear your opinion on it. I never really believed in ghosts and things like that. Now, one evening, a few weeks ago, we closed the horror mazes that the park had opened for its Halloween event. Two of these mazes are located in a quite old historic building, one in the basement and one at the very top on the top floor. We closed the first maze. In the basement, as usual, walked through everything and made sure that really no one was inside anymore. There is a section in the maze where you pass many shelves of jars. In such horror mazes, the actors use internal corridors through which they can quickly get from one area to the next to create better scares. Something like shortcuts through the maze layout. I went into such a staff corridor next to these shelves because I thought I heard someone. I went in to check and saw a small boy in really old, medieval-looking clothing. I asked if everything was okay with him, and he ran away. I couldn't find him. He wasn't even pale or transparent, but looked like a completely normal boy. I told myself I had just imagined it, and simply continued in the rest of the maze. But the next part is what I cannot explain. When we had closed the first maze, we went up the stairs to the second one and started walking through. I honestly can't tell you how this happened, but first you need to know something. The maze is huge, and it takes about 15 minutes to walk through it completely. There are no hidden rooms, apart from these internal corridors, because it is at the very top. And if you were to go beyond the walls, you would fall into the depths. So we walked through as a group, and then suddenly everything went dark. When or how, but I found myself in a completely dark, silent room. Not too cold and not too warm. For matches, as if everything were perfectly balanced. Assumed I had gotten into one of those internal corridors. 3 steps before I saw a thin line of light like a crack in the wall. I took a few more steps and stepped through. I was back in the maze. I came out at the dollhouse, and that is exactly the point. The dollhouse was at the other end of the maze. I was completely confused, but when I turned around, the crack in the wall was gone. About 10 minutes later, my group came around the corner and asked where I had been. I told them what happened, but the crack was obviously gone. Quite honestly, what happened was practically impossible. How can you end up at the other end of a maze in a few steps that normally takes up to 10 minutes? That's why I'm writing this at all. Does anyone know what that could have been? Does something like this sound familiar to you? Am I going crazy? Please, I need answers. Our story. There was a boy I became friends with in middle school. We were both kind of outcasts. We both did theater, read a lot, and didn't have many friends. I'll call him Charlie. There was one time Charlie came to my house. I will try really hard to do this justice, because it sends a shiver down my spine every time I think back to it. My sister had recently celebrated a scary party in our basement. There were still black light bulbs screwed in everywhere, instead of normal light bulbs. We hung out downstairs, and I wish I could remember more of this conversation. But in short, Charlie was very strange and said things I didn't really know how to react to. Dark and intense. He asked me for matches. He spoke of having something like a dark presence and being possessed. I think he realized I didn't really believe him and told me he could prove it. Above us were 2 rows of 3 lamps each. Lamp in the first row. "This lamp will go out," he said, laughed, and waited. After about 30 seconds had passed, I was just about to say something, and the moment I did, the lamp not only went out, it also burst so loudly that I really flinched, and I stared at him. He has this inexplicable look in his eyes. His eyes were naturally dark brown. It was just so intense and unsettling. He did other things during this meeting. For example, he insulted me for playing the lead role in a play at our local theater. That was so not typical of him. I didn't really know what to do. He was constantly around me at school, so I sort of played it down. We played for a while longer, and I did my best to carry on. A few weeks later was my birthday, and Charlie had been invited a month ago, along with 2 friends of mine, Lana and Chloe. We all met at my house and then decided to walk downtown. Not even a mile from my house, there was a small path in a densely wooded area that served as a shortcut. While we were walking, Charlie started talking about graves and death. Chloe, Lana, and I all looked at each other somewhat uncomfortably. I don't remember exactly what Charlie said. For matches, but it was a serious tirade delivered with deep conviction about him being the Prince of Death, and that being a part of him or something like that. I don't remember what else he said, but he talked so long that it turned more into a growl, deep, intense, with a booming voice, when he suddenly sprang at Lana's throat without any provocation. He grabbed her and choked her with full force. I'm not proud of it, but as soon as I saw Lana hit him and get him off her, Lana, Chloe, and I all lived in the same neighborhood, just a few houses apart, and we sprinted as fast as we could and didn't dare look back. I don't really know what I was thinking, but we all decided to split up. So I slammed my door shut and sat in my room, terrified and not knowing what to do. Parents were not home, and I sat there for what felt like hours. Then the police knocked on our door. My older sister answered. She came upstairs horrified and asked why the police said Charlie had rung a neighbor's doorbell topless, without a phone, and missing a shoe, and was completely battered and beaten up. I was horrified. I knew with absolute certainty that when we left, he still had his phone, his top, and his shoes. A while later, my parents came home, and the police came back to question me. I told them everything, and they claimed the other girls had told them a different story. I have no idea why they would have done that, and I insisted that I had nothing else to tell them. Apparently, Charlie had been in and out of psychiatric wards repeatedly, which I hadn't known about, and they had just recently adjusted his medication. Before he asked me, nothing further came of the matter with the police, and I didn't see Charlie at school for at least a whole year after that. Obviously, the boy has mental health issues by societal standards, but nothing will ever explain how that light went out, and that will leave me uneasy forever. I don't know why I have to think about it now, but it was one of the scariest moments of my life, and I just had to ask if anyone has a similar story or knows if this is related to any folklore. Our story. a few friends, and I wanted to meet up to smoke a joint. They were together in a car, and I waited it in the park for them to pick me up. We wanted to meet at the parking lot at the park. To explain it as best I can, the parking lot is laid out long and narrow, and on both sides a soccer field runs parallel to it at the back end of the parking lot. And the soccer fields. A forest begins at the edge of town. I parked right in the middle of the parking lot under the only street lamp. It was night and raining heavily. Pulled up. I got out of my car and got into theirs, and we drove off. That's when we saw someone walking straight toward my car. I mentioned the soccer fields earlier to emphasize how strange this was. Matches. This person had walked over half the length of a soccer field, maintaining exactly the same diagonal angle the whole time. Best way I can describe it like a bishop in chess, always on the same diagonal. In this moment I told my friend we had to wait by the road. I really thought someone was about to break into my car. The person reached my car. Another step or two, and they would have walked right into it. Then, without hesitating, they turned, walked along the back of the car, turned again at the end, and walked along the other side, turned one more time, walked a few steps past the front, finally turned back onto exactly that diagonal line to continue walking into the forest in the rain. The pace of their walk didn't change a single time. It wasn't quite fast walking, but not slow either, just very steady and methodical. We always said it. Felt like the monster from It Follows accidentally observed something on its way to a target. Right after that, my friends take me back to my car, and we decided to meet at the Walmart parking lot instead. Our story. This story is just another small town ghost story. I am here to tell you that it is far more than that. Note that the exact names of places, as well as plants and people, have been changed. It was in the early 1990s when my family packed up our lives and moved to the narrow strip of land in Oklahoma. I was laid off in Kansas City, and the economy there offered me few options. Since I had to support my family with 2 small daughters, a cousin of my wife, Cheryl, mentioned that they were hiring at a pig processing plant in Guyman. We were so desperate that this chance seemed like a twist of fate. We found a decent 2-story rental on the outskirts of town, 3 bedrooms, faded wallpaper from the 70s, and creaky floorboards that announced every midnight trip to the bathroom. The girls, Melissa, 8 years old, and Jenny, matches, 6 years old, shared a room upstairs with a window overlooking the backyard. Back then, moving was still an adventure and not a trauma. Luckily, on the day of our arrival, our neighbor came by, brought a casserole, and warned us about the August heat while she fanned herself on our porch. She said we had picked a damn bad time to move to this area. She added that we would have a hard adjustment in winter when the wind comes down and freezes everything it touches. The Westland pig processing plant was just a short drive from our house. Building was huge. Imagine everything made of corrugated iron, concrete, industrial efficiency, isolated in a flat landscape like a butcher's fortress. On my first day of work, the plant manager, I'll call him D, gave me a tour. He shouted over the noise of the machines and bragged proudly that about 16,000 pigs were processed daily before he asked me for matches, almost as if he were telling of the successes of his own children. He explained that I would work on the cutting floor. My hourly wage would be about $11, overtime possible almost every week, and health insurance kicks in after 90 days. The work was brutal. I had done physical labor before, but nothing comparable to this constantly repetitive, exhausting activity. After every shift, my shoulders and back screamed in pain. But the smell, that was something else entirely. It penetrated everything: clothes, skin, hair, even the nostrils. It was a mixture of blood, terrible disinfectant, and something I couldn't quite place, maybe just the meat itself. Almost every night I came home smelling like it. My daughters found it disgusting and hilarious. Jenny screamed that Daddy smelled like rotten sausages, holding her nose theatrically, while Melissa burst into peals of laughter. Cheryl was less amused and demanded daily that I strip in the garage, throw the clothes directly into the washing machine, shower before touching anything. Despite all these hardships, I was glad, for we would make it. The pay was good and reliable. We could pay our bills, and the girls were adjusting well to their new school. But in a plant like Westland, you can't work without hearing stories. In the break room, during smoke breaks in the locker room, everywhere the men gathered, there were stories. Much of it was usual gossip, rumors about who was with whom, who was stealing, and which supervisor was a wimp. It didn't take long until I heard a story that kept popping up in different versions. I heard it first from M.P., who had worked at Westland for 15 years and was just one station away from me. We were sitting at lunch break when he nudged me and pointed toward an older area of the plant that could be seen through the break room window. Between bites, he mentioned that this area had been the main cutting floor in the 70s, the place where old Harold Wace had perished. I asked what he meant by perished, as this expression was still foreign to me. Nem looked at me as if I were stupid and explained that perished meant he died, and told that this happened around 1976 or 1977. Harold Weiss was about 60 years old and had worked most of his life there. Legend had it Harold tripped and fell into a grinder, leaving only his left boot. I grimaced. Such things disgusted me. I said it sounded terrible. Em added that it gets worse. Some people believed Harold didn't just trip, but was pushed by a certain other man who allegedly had an affair with Harold's wife. It was absurd. I remember thinking, olds in love affairs. Hopefully, I still have that much energy at my age. And said that this man worked the same shift as Harold and would have had the perfect opportunity, even if nothing was ever proven. Matches. In the following weeks, I heard different versions of Harold's death. In some tales, it wasn't the grinder that got him, an industrial saw, if that was supposed to sound better somehow. In other versions, Harold had caught his sleeve in a conveyor belt that pulled him into the machinery. The details changed, but some elements remained the same. Harold was an older man. His death was always gruesome, and many believed it was no accident. Another colleague, whom I called C, he asked me one day if I had ever heard noises from the oldest part of the plant at night. I denied it, since I had only worked one night shift so far, looked serious, and warned me that I would hear something eventually. He explained that maintenance staff never go into that area alone after dark because they claimed to hear footsteps and machines starting by themselves. A man swore he had seen Harold himself standing at his old workstation, just there, staring. Laughed because every workplace has its ghost stories, furs. But I must confess that after these tales I glanced more often into the old area of the plant. About 4 months after I started, I was working a double shift, and due to understaffing my eyes were already tired and blurring. On the way to the toilet, before then, through a rarely used corridor leading into the older part of the plant. The floor was wet due to condensation, always a risk in food processing, and I was very careful with my step. About halfway through I felt a distinct pressure on my ankle, as if someone had stuck out their foot to trip me. I stumbled forward, arms flailing as I tried to keep my balance. To my right stood a silent grinder. Even though it was still, I could imagine that falling into it could be painful or even deadly. For a brief moment, I was convinced I would fall. I could already feel the cold metal on me. My heart raced as I braced myself against the wall, fingernails scratching the concrete. When I turned around, I expected to see someone, maybe a colleague, laughing, but the corridor was completely empty. I stood there, took a deep breath, and stared at the empty space where I had felt the pressure. At exactly that moment, the light directly above that spot flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I called out if anyone was there. My voice sounded scared and panicked, but I got no answer, only the distant hum of machines from the active area of the plant. I told myself I had been too tired and had just imagined the whole thing. But as I hastily returned to the main area and left the grinder behind me, a cold, gnawing doubt spread within me. Something had tried to bring me down, something I couldn't see. I told Cheryl nothing about this incident at the factory. She had enough stress with her job search and settling the girls in. Honestly, I thought I had just imagined it. Exhaustion plays tricks on you sometimes. A week later, something happened in our home. On a day off, I was alone in the kitchen washing dishes while Cheryl took the girls to their new doctor's appointments. The radio was playing softly a station with Western music, one of the few we could receive clearly. Busy. I was up to my wrists in soapy water when I suddenly felt something, a firm shove right between my shoulder blades. It wasn't violent, but distinct enough that I stumbled forward and hit the edge of the sink, splashing water onto my shirt. I turned around, my heart racing, but the kitchen was empty. I called out if anyone was there, but the house remained silent, apart from the quiet radio and the steady drip of a leaky faucet. Afterward, I checked every room, convinced that an intruder had sneaked into our house, but all doors were locked and the windows fine. When I returned to the kitchen, I felt uneasy. At exactly that moment, the radio signal switched to harsh white noise that made me flinch. When I tried to change the station, it jumped back to the station with Western music as if nothing had happened. These incidents started small. First, single items moved from their places. Cold spots, cold spots appeared in random areas of the house, and I constantly had the feeling of being watched, showering or changing. I tried to give the whole thing a rational explanation. Matches. Was it the old creaking house, or maybe something underground causing disturbances? But I just couldn't fully explain it. The shoves continued, always from behind, always when I didn't expect it. Once when I was in the garage getting tools, matches. Another time when I was going up the stairs, and again when I was standing at the stove in the kitchen and felt this shove. It was never like it hurt me, at least not yet, but it was persistent, as if someone wanted to force my attention. After about a month of these incidents, I mentioned casually at lunch break that I felt strange in the factory, that I had the feeling of being pushed during the first incident. C shook his head, laughed a little as if he had heard it often. Then he surprisingly lowered his voice and asked if anything had happened at my home yet. My mouth hung open, and I asked him how he even knew that, crossed his arms, and said it must have been Harold. You mean the man who died in the accident? I asked, with a brief He confirmed it and explained that it doesn't happen to everyone, but those Harold shows interest in are affected. He fell silent, stared at me for a moment, added that I resembled Harold a little, something about my eyes and jawline. That made me shudder. I said that was ridiculous. Matches. But he countered that maybe there was something to it and pointed out that there was a photo of Harold in the hallway next to HR. Memorial wall for employees who had died. He suggested I go look at it if I didn't believe him. That same afternoon I went to the memorial wall. It was a modest collection of framed photos with small brown nameplates and their years of service. Most photos were formal portraits or snapshots from company parties. Harold's photo was towards the end of the row, a color photo from the mid-70s. He had thinning gray hair, deep, set eyes, and a prominent jaw. The brass played simply Harold Wace 1916, 1976, 30 years of service. It was obvious. There was a certain resemblance, not so much that we were twins, but enough that it stood out. Same eye color, same jawline. Even both of us had the left eyebrow slightly higher than the right. Before he asked me for matches, I stared at the photo, and for a moment I could have sworn Harold's eyes were looking at me. That scared me so much that I almost bumped into a passing secretary. Sorry, I mumbled and hurried away. Afterward, the incidents increased. Maybe Harold knew I had seen his photo. Matches. The shoves became more frequent and intense, and suddenly doors began to slam although no draft was felt, and the TV turned on by itself several times, turning to static noise in the middle of the night. Asked me for matches. Our girls complained about nightmares where an old man stood at the foot of their beds watching them. Cheryl soon noticed that something was wrong with the house. One evening, when a shelf full of dishes collapsed for no apparent reason, she asked, "Is this house haunted?" Of course, I lied and said it was just an old, somewhat unstable and creaky house, but I was to be mistaken. The worst was yet to come. A Tuesday evening in November, I had just come home from work. Beaver. In matches. I was in the shower trying to wash off the stench of the factory when Cheryl was downstairs in the kitchen preparing dinner, and the girls were in their room, supposedly busy with homework. I was just turning off the water when suddenly I heard deafening screams. Not normal children's screams, but screams of horrific terror that froze my blood. Matches. I hastily wrapped a towel around myself and almost ran out of the shower, nearly slipping on the wet floor. The screams came from the children's room. Cheryl was already at the door, pulling the handle and screaming back, asking what was wrong. When she saw me, she yelled that the door wouldn't open because it was locked and that the girls were trapped inside screaming. I told the children to open the door while I rattled the handle myself. Melissa's voice rang out in a high panic pitch, saying they couldn't open the door, that it was stuck. She screamed that a man was at the window, and Jenny screamed too. Her voice sounded like she was about to vomit. We had no locks on the upstairs doors, so there was no way the door could be locked. Cheryl to stand back before I rammed the door with my shoulder. Pain shot through my collarbone. The door didn't move. On the fourth attempt, something splintered and the door flew open. Matches. The two girls were huddled in the corner, far away from the window, holding onto each other, crying. The window stood wide open. Cold November air streamed in, and the curtains blew wildly in the wind. I rushed to the children, while Cheryl closed the window and asked what happened and who opened it. Between sobs, Jenny explained that it had been this old man who stood outside and looked in. Cheryl said that was impossible since we lived on the second floor, but Melissa insisted, her face pale with horror, saying the man had actually been there. She explained that he told them they should just climb out and he would catch them. I leaned to the window to look out. There was no ledge, no branch to step on, just a free fall into the frost-covered backyard. I don't see anyone there, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady, although deep unease grew within me. Girls, nightmare or something, I tried to explain. When night fell, we all spent the night in the living room. The girls squeezed together on the sofa bed. No one said much, but I felt Cheryl's unspoken questions growing in her mind. She wanted to know what was going on here. Before I should have told her everything about the incidents at the factory, the shoves at home, Harold's photo, and our uncanny resemblance. But I feared she would think I was losing my mind, so I merely agreed that something was wrong with the house and suggested we look for a new home. After Cheryl had fallen asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, felt guilty because I hadn't told her everything, and it seemed as if someone else was in the room, something terrorizing my family. The following week, we moved out of the house and stayed temporarily in guest houses while we desperately searched for a new home. In sick to work, using some of my precious sick days. The eerie occurrences seemed to subside as long as we weren't in the house, which reinforced Cheryl's belief that the problem was the building. On the following Monday, to work exhausted and tense, when I met C again, he asked me if it was getting better or worse. Too tired to lie, the ghost I told him the truth. The ghost had tried to get my children to jump out of a second-story window. C was completely shocked, and I explained to him that I had to leave this place and move as far away as possible. C agreed, hesitantly, but noted regretfully that Harold's ghost had always been angry, But he had never seen anything like that, and I didn't like that at all. Luckily for me, this day was my last at Westland. I told the plant manager I had a family emergency and would not be returning, and I wasn't lying. On the way to my car, I walked past the old part of the factory, felt I had to say something, and called loudly into the seemingly empty space. "Harold, I'm sorry for what happened to you, but please leave my family alone." Then I hurried to my car and never looked back. We moved to a place 3 hours away from there. I finally found a job at the post office. The pay was significantly worse, but the hours were regular and there were no ghostly figures trying to harm my children. Life returned to normal, and it has stayed normal to this day. Our story. I started working for a certain railway company in 1986, inspecting tracks in the Northwest. Most don't understand how much maintenance railroad tracks require. Steel beams carrying tons of freight daily expand, contract, warp, in ways that require constant monitoring. That's exactly where I came in, walking miles of remote rail lines to spot problems before they lead to derailments. Nearing retirement, thinks I should write down some of my experiences while my memory is still fresh. Mostly, I think she refers to the stories I tell her children about wildlife encounters and some of the strange characters one meets in remote train stations. But there is one experience from the summer of 1988 that I have never told them. Never anyone except my supervisor at the time, who was transferred to another department not long after. At that time I was 32, 2 years on the job, and still proving myself. I was single, had dates here and there, but nothing serious. But my brother Christopher had died 8 months prior at the age of 38 from a sudden aneurysm, leaving behind his wife and 3 children under 10. On my days off, I often helped her out. Took my nephew to play Little League, and took my niece to her dance classes to replace Christopher as best I could, although no one could replace him. In June, I was assigned to inspect a roughly 40-mile section of track running through a remote area in eastern Montana. The track had shown unusual wear patterns that didn't match normal usage. My job was to check sections of the track on foot with special equipment, record readings, and document any irregularities. I checked into a small hotel in the nearest town, about 20 minutes from my work site, a simple place with wood paneling and worn bedspreads. But at least there was hot water, and it was clean enough for me. The lady at the reception became more animated when I mentioned I would be working on the rail line before matches. She asked which section I would be inspecting, and when I told her, her expression changed slightly. She mentioned that her grandfather had helped build this section of track in the early 1930s, always claimed that it was cursed ground, and the original survey team had all died under strange circumstances. After nodding politely, I gave little credence to these tales. Every small town has such stories. Railroad folklore is full of ghosts and curses, matches, which isn't surprising for a profession that has claimed many lives over the decades. My first day on sight was uneventful. The rails looked normal at first glance, but my measurements revealed subtle deformations not explainable by normal wear. The patterns were very symmetrical, occurring at exact intervals over almost a quarter mile. In what we called Section 42, the precision bothered me. Nature doesn't work with such regularity, and train wheels don't behave like that either. Also, I noticed my equipment behaving strangely in this section. The electronic gauges fluctuated wildly, and my fully charged batteries were dead in less than an hour. Too much. I had to manuals, tools, the old-fashioned calipers and levels railroaders have used for a century. It was dawning when I saw him for the first time. I was about halfway through the section busy with measurements, kneeling beside the rail with my back to the setting sun. When I stood up to check my notes, I noticed a man standing about 100 yards ahead of me beside the tracks. In itself, that wasn't unusual. It wasn't uncommon for locals to walk along the rails, although this was a particularly remote section. What struck me, however, was his clothing. He wore a suit cut in a style that seemed decades old, not quite antique, but definitely not modern. Not like 1980s fashion. In the fading light, I could barely make out his features. I called out a standard greeting, but the distance didn't allow me to see his reaction. Still, something seemed to subtly change in his posture. He straightened up. His posture became unnaturally stiff. I took a few steps toward him. Then I saw his smile become visible. Even from that distance, just very wide and beaming. I lowered my gaze for a brief moment to close my notebook, and when I looked up again, I swear he was gone, just like that. The landscape offered hardly any hiding places. It was just flat terrain with sparse vegetation. No one could have moved out of sight that quickly. I finished my work for the day and drove back to the hotel, trying to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was a hiker hiding behind the track bed. Maybe an optical trick making a natural object look like a person. The rational explanations didn't quite fit. They were at least better than the alternatives. That night I dreamed of the same man standing at the foot of my bed, just staring at me and smiling. At 3 a.m., bathed in sweat and couldn't go back to sleep. Matches. The next morning I called my supervisor to report the unusual readings from Section 42, but didn't mention the man I had seen. Befores. My supervisor said the readings were concerning enough that for safety reasons he would send another inspector to join me. The company didn't take rail integrity in remote areas lightly. A derailment in the middle of nowhere can cost millions and potentially claim dozens of lives. My colleague arrived late afternoon. Strangely, everyone called him Gob. He asked me for matches. He was an experienced and heavily built inspector in his late 50s who had been working here much longer than I. During the drive to the site, I asked about his nickname. He explained it referred to him always carrying homemade peanut clusters, gobs, and he offered me some from a paper bag. They were kind of sweet, nutty chunks that tasted pretty good, but when I asked for the recipe, he just winked and said it was a family secret. Gob was exactly what you would expect from a long-time railroader. Knowledgeable, uncompromising on safety issues, but full of colorful stories from his years on the job. provided good company while we performed measurements in section 42. After what I had seen, I was glad to have company. The equipment problems continued. Cobb's devices went haywire in exactly the same way as mine, and his watch stopped completely when we entered the section and only started again when we left it. Weird, right? He frowned at it, but said nothing further, except that he had never seen anything like the wear patterns we were measuring. Around 100 p.m., we took a lunch break and sat on some maintenance blocks near the tracks. I was just about to bite into a sandwich when I spotted him again, the smiling man. This time he stood about 50 yards further down the track watching us. In daylight, I could see him much more clearly. He wore a dark suit with a vest. His hair was neatly parted, and that uncanny smile was fixed on his face. His skin was pale, almost waxy, even from this distance. I nudged Gob and pointed in his direction, asking if he saw that man too. Gob squinted and shook his head. He couldn't spot anyone. For matches. So I described the man's appearance to him. Then Gob's expression changed. He asked if I was sure about the clothes. Confirmed this. He quickly packed up his lunch and suggested we move to another section and come back to this one later. As we walked away, I looked back once more, and the man had vanished again. That evening at the hotel, and I went over our findings over a few beers in my room. After the technical details were discussed, I pressed him to tell me more about his reaction to my earlier sighting. He asked me for matches hesitantly. He finally began to tell me that his grandfather had traveled the same rail line in the 1930s, before he had. His grandfather quit the railroad after an inspection run in this exact section and refused to say more about what had happened since. Gadi Atches, other than to say he had seen things that couldn't be explained. The family assumed he had seen a bad accident or found a body on the tracks. Matches. But my description of the man in old-fashioned clothes with an unusual smile had triggered something in Gob's memory. A conversation he had overheard as a child when his grandfather had drunk too much at a family reunion. After Gob went to his room, I showered. The bathroom was tiny, just a shower stall and a plastic curtain. I was rinsing shampoo from my hair, eyes closed, when I felt the air change. Maybe a drop in temperature, I don't know. When I opened my eyes, I saw through the shower curtain a distinct silhouette, tall, motionless, standing right on the other side, right there. In panic, I ripped the curtain aside, rattling the soap dishes. But the bathroom was empty. The door was still locked from the inside, just as I had left it. That night I found hardly any sleep. The next morning Gob looked pretty shaken. Notches. He admitted he felt nauseous and had a severe headache. He also mentioned it felt like someone was watching him all night, even though he was alone in his room, with blinds drawn and door locked. After a few hours of trying to do a little work, he decided to return to base and promised to send another partner if available. Before he left, he pulled me aside, far away from the tracks. His usually calm tone was gone. He explained to me that his grandfather had traveled this section alone after his partner unexpectedly quit. What happened afterward was so terrible that the family never spoke of it again, warned me to be careful and consider asking for a transfer to another section. Then he added something strange. He asked if I had a brother when I mentioned Christopher, who had recently passed away. Gob nodded as if confirming something in his memory. Then he just got in his truck and drove off. I continued my work alone, methodically documenting the irregularities in Section 42. As the day progressed, the feeling of being watched grew until it felt almost physical, like pressure on my neck. Afternoon, I was kneeling to check a particularly unusual wear pattern when I heard footsteps in the gravel beside the tracks. I was facing the smiling man directly, now less than 10 feet away. Up close, he looked even more sinister. His suit was immaculate, but clearly from another era, with a pocket watch chain visible across his vest. His skin had a bloodless quality no living human should have, but it was his face that froze me. Asked me for matches. Features that seemed normal at first became increasingly uncanny the longer I looked at him. His smile revealed too many teeth, perfect, straight, and white, and his eyes, I swear, seemed normal at first. As he stared at me, they darkened until they were black, like dark ink falling into water. Then he spoke and said a name. Mine. Christopher. I corrected him immediately and explained that Christopher was my brother and dead. The words had left my mouth before I even considered whether I should keep talking to this entity, whatever or whoever it was, if that was even possible. And then he said simply, "Wrong brother." It sounded like multiple people speaking in unison, but slightly out of sync. The shrill sound of a train horn pierced this moment. Instinctively I turned toward the sound, and when I looked back, the man was gone. He asked me for matches. A few minutes later, an eastbound freight train thundered past, and the engineer waved casually at me as if inspectors by the tracks were everyday occurrences. After the train had passed, I found my notebook open on the ground where I had been working. Flipping through it, I discovered page after page containing the same handwritten phrase. Not by me. Wrong brother, wrong brother, wrong brother. I finished my inspection as fast as I could and drove back to the hotel, too agitated to even think about stopping anywhere to eat. I called my supervisor on the bedside phone and reported everything, the readings, the equipment failures, and yes, even the man with the impossible smile who coincidentally knew my brother's name. To my relief, my supervisor didn't just dismiss my statements. He asked me for matches. He asked some questions about track conditions and promised to send a whole crew to inspect the section properly. I was so exhausted that I could sleep almost without problems that night. Except that I woke up at 3 a.m. again because something didn't feel right. The bedside lamp was on, although I was sure I had turned it off. On the nightstand lay several small objects, arranged in a circle. Matches. My brother's pocket watch engraved with his initials, a silver dollar he carried for good luck, and his wedding ring. Items I didn't just have with me. None of them should have been in my room. The pocket watch and silver dollar belonged to a small box of personal belongings I kept in my apartment, and the ring that was buried with him. Matches. At first light, I signed off and never returned to that section. I finished my reports, and with that, time being. 6 months later, I heard through company channels that a freight train had derailed there, repairs made after my departure. I wasn't told the exact reason. Last month my nephew helped me. I call him James, Christopher's oldest son, who is now in his 40s and has children of his own, clear out old boxes for my garage. In doing so, he found a folder of sketches I had made in my early days at the railroad, mostly technical drawings of track components, but in between was also a rough sketch of a smiling man. The James asked who that was when he saw it. It was immediately terrifyingly familiar. I told him it was just some random guy I met on the job. But then he said something that alarmed me. Betold me that his 10-year-old child had been drawing a similarly looking figure for quite some time. A man with a very wide smile, black eyes, and in a suit from a bygone era. I don't know what all this means. I don't know what this man is or why he fixates on my brother, but he should damn well leave my family alone.